teacher at Palo Alto commenting on a news article this week said that in a typical week, roughly 5 out of every 30 essays come back flagged by Turnitin's AI detector at 50% or higher AI content. Multiply that across a full teaching load, and you're looking at somewhere between 100 and 150 potential cheating cases in a single year per teacher, on top of everything else. That comment came up below an article about a parent suing the same district over an essay flagged by that same tool. The lawsuit was the headline, but I think the teacher's comment is the real story here. Hello and welcome to another episode of AI in the Classroom Daily, a podcast helping educators make sense of AI without the hype. I'm Dan Cogan-Drew, and I use AI as a thinking partner in preparing each of these episodes because I think the best way to talk honestly about AI in education is to work with it openly. So today's episode is about a federal lawsuit that was filed last week against Palo Alto Unified School District by a parent whose son's essay was flagged as AI generated. We're going to talk about the lawsuit, but only briefly, because really I think the more useful story is what showed up in the comment thread underneath the article. The lawsuit is one family's grievance, but the comment thread is a much wider conversation, and it's the conversation almost every district I'm speaking with this year is having in one form or another. So this episode is for teachers who are wondering what a fair process looks like when a detector raises a flag. It's for coaches thinking about how to support the people in their building who are absorbing those flags. And it's for district leaders who want to know what their current process would actually do if a case like this walked through the door tomorrow. So let's start with the facts as reported by Palo Alto Online. A parent in Palo Alto Unified has filed a federal lawsuit against the district. His son, a sophomore at Palo Alto High School, wrote an essay on Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible, last October. When the essay was submitted through Turnitin, the platform flagged it as 76% AI generated. The student's teacher asked him to rewrite the essay in class on paper without internet access. He got a D on the rewrite, and that dropped his class grade from a B to a C. The family submitted approximately 1,200 pages of evidence to refute the claim, drafts, notes, document revision history. The district held its position, and the family is now suing on multiple grounds, including discrimination, retaliation, lack of due process, and improper grading procedure. One detail worth noting for the record is that the parent who filed the lawsuit is the founder and CEO of an AI company. I'm going to mention that and set it aside. I think it's relevant, but it's not the whole story. The story really is the conditions. And here's why I want to move past the lawsuit itself, is that we don't know what happened with that essay. We don't know how strong the teacher's other evidence was. We don't know what the student actually wrote. The federal lawsuit isn't going to settle the harder questions for the rest of us. And I'm not interested really in litigating one family's case on the podcast. What I am interested in is what's underneath the case, because the conditions that produced it exist in almost every high school in the country right now. Now, before I get into the comment thread, I want to share something from my own teaching, because I think the listener deserves to know that I'm approaching this case not as an abstraction, but it's evoking memories. In the late 1990s, I was teaching a humanities class in the U.S. Navy. I had a sailor in that class who didn't speak much in class, whose writing throughout the year had been relatively brief. My feedback on his papers had been what you would usually see a teacher writing in a situation like that. Say more. What do you mean here? How does this prove your point? More elaboration I was asking for, in other words. Towards the end of this spring, he handed in an essay on Plato's Allegory of the Cave that was considerably longer than anything he'd written before, and it was articulate in a way his prior work had not been. It just didn't read to me like it was his voice. I asked him to come to office hours, and when he did, I told him that I didn't think it was his paper. He insisted that it was. I had no Turnitin score, that didn't exist. The internet existed, but it wasn't really the looming presence that it is now. AI wasn't part of the conversation at all. What I had was my memory of his earlier writing, which I hadn't kept because back then papers were handed in on paper, and I didn't keep every one of them. I handed them back to students. I had that, and I had a feeling. I remember being anxious going into that meeting because I knew that I was making a serious accusation, and I had very little to stand on. The conversation, as I remember it, was tense. He denied it, and ultimately I let it go. I could tell walking out of that meeting that something between us had shifted, even though there had been no consequence that I had imposed on him. And today, I don't know back then whether I was right or wrong about that essay. The reason I tell that story is that the teacher who commented on this article said that before AI, teachers could easily tell the difference between authentic and dishonest student writing. And I have a lot of sympathy for that comment because I can relate to it, but I don't think it's quite true. The predicament we're talking about today, the teacher reading a paper that doesn't quite sound like the student with limited evidence, having to decide whether to make an accusation, that's a predicament that's been around for decades. What's new is not the predicament. What's new is the scale of it. And the role a number from a tool is being asked to play in helping resolve it. That number, of course, is the Turnitin score. That brings me to the comment thread. A teacher who commented on the article describing themselves as a current Paley teacher from Palo Alto, not involved in the case, laid out the scale problem in pretty concrete terms. She said 5 classes of 30 students, 2 to 3 essays per semester in English, roughly 5 essays per class coming back flagged at 50% AI or higher. That's potentially 100 to 150 cases of suspected academic dishonesty per year per teacher on top of teaching the class. This is what the teacher has to deal with. This teacher said plainly that some of those flags are probably accurate, some are probably partial use of AI for editing or refinement, and some are probably false positives, including, they noted, on their own writing when they tested the tool. False positives, as we've talked about on this podcast, are not uncommon. AI does not do a good job of detecting AI. Now, a current student commented that one AP class has moved entirely to paper-only essays. A parent of a student with dyslexia responded that paper-only writing is, for her child, a form of exclusion, not a fairer assessment, but a harder one to demonstrate learning. Another parent described a child on an IEP whose accommodations didn't seem to allow the rewrite in class model. Several commenters referenced a letter from Vanderbilt University published back in 2023 explaining why that institution stopped using Turnitin's AI detector. I'll include that in the show notes, and I'm displaying it here. These are anonymous online comments, and any individual claim is unverifiable. But taken together, I think it's recognizable as a snapshot of what the people in and around one high school are thinking out loud. It matches what I'm hearing from teachers in other districts across the country. Now, 2 things about the underlying tools here. First, the research on AI detectors, as I was mentioning, is not encouraging. Multiple universities have either disabled or de-emphasized them, citing both false positive rates and uneven performance across student populations. Earlier this year, we talked about a Stanford preprint by May Tan and colleagues documenting demographic bias in AI-generated writing feedback. Feedback, this is, not detection, but I think the 2 things are closely related. The pattern is consistent with the MIT chatbot study we covered in an earlier AI bias in classroom chatbots episode. AI systems perform unevenly across student populations, and multilingual writers and students who write in less conventional patterns tend to be on the wrong end of the unevenness. Now, knowing all of that, I don't think that teachers can treat a Turnitin score as evidence. Rather, I think it's a prompt for a conversation with the student. When schools treat it as evidence, I think that's when things go downhill in a hurry. Second, the in-class rewrite, the practice at the center of this lawsuit, isn't inherently wrong. I think as an investigatory step, it's a way of asking a student to demonstrate their thinking on the same prompt in a controlled setting. And in that way, it's defensible. But the teacher who commented on the article said they've used this approach with about 10 students this year, and all 10 essays were strong, which the teacher took as a sign that the process was working. I would say that the question isn't really whether you can ask a student to rewrite. The question is what the rewrite is for. If it's an investigation, the student should know that, and the result of the investigation should be a judgment about authorship, not a final grade. If it's a consequence, that's a different thing, and it needs a different kind of due process, including how it interacts with IEP accommodations or English language learner status. So here's what I take for this on behalf of each of 3 different audiences maybe listening to this conversation. For classroom teachers, when you see a high AI flag, is there a conversation with the student before anything else happens? Is there a process you can describe to a parent in 1 sentence? I would suggest that if you're improvising on a case-by-case basis, it may be worth comparing notes with a colleague, and if the improvisation is getting out of hand, you should raise this with an instructional coach for more systematic guidance. Which brings me to instructional coaches. I think you have a role to play here. The question here should be instructional and not disciplinary. And coaches like you are in a strong position to help departments develop shared working agreements. That is, a shared understanding of what evidence looks like, what the conversation sounds like, and how accommodations are being honored. If each teacher in your building is figuring this out alone, that's a flag and I think a call to action. And finally, for district leaders, I would suggest this situation prompts a specific exercise that you can run. Take the Palo Alto case as what we call a tabletop. Pretend it happened in your high school last Tuesday. Walk it through your current process. Ask yourself, where does the student go to dispute the flag? Who reviews the evidence? What is their appeals path, if any? And how are IEP accommodations being honored if there's a rewrite? How does the family know what their options are? If you have difficulty answering that question, it may be a sign that there's unnecessary friction or ambiguity in the current process and you should revisit it. So moving to takeaways here, the instinct in a story like this, I think, is to argue about whether the kid cheated. That's a question for the court and the family and the school, and none of us listening have the evidence to answer it. I'd say the principle behind that question is where we should be focusing. That is what we want to be able to tell with confidence whether a piece of writing belongs to a student. Right now, with the tools available, we probably can't, at least not reliably enough to treat a number from a detector as the end of the conversation, which means the process for handling uncertainty is doing more work than most schools have explicitly designed it to do. The Palo Alto case is a stress test of that process, and it's worth running the same test on your own before someone else runs it for you. So, questions for teachers and for coaches here. For teachers, as I asked, if one of your students gets a high AI flag, what's your first move? Is it the same move every time? And for coaches, does your department have a shared answer to that question, or is each teacher figuring it out on their own? I'd really like to hear how this is playing out. As I mentioned, I'm in conversation with a lot of districts who are wrestling with this issue on a daily basis. Please drop a comment, share this episode with a colleague who's been chewing on the same question. Let me know what you're seeing. We've covered the Vanderbilt letter, the MIT chatbot bias study, and the broader questions about transparency in earlier episodes. Those are going to be linked in the show notes if you want to follow the thread. And as always, thanks for listening.